Hey everybody, this is Rob Archangel, and I'm back with another review. And today I want to talk about some fiction. In this case, All Star Superman. Now I have a copy of this bad boy right here. Let's see, there you go. And this is one of my favorite stories, actually. And I've been thinking about fiction a little bit recently, and mythology and storytelling and superheroes and sort of archetypal figures. Part of that is because I've been listening to a lot of Dr. Jordan Peterson, who is a Canadian psychologist, and he's embroiled in a bit of a free speech battle. Interestingly, since I did a review of Silenced, Mike Cernovich's documentary on free speech, and he's Dr. Peterson, a really interesting guy. I think has shown a lot of courage, a lot of conviction, a lot of precision in his use of language and how he's talked about some of the issues that he's dealing with. Particularly, he got into trouble over the use of compelled pronouns for gender binary people. But maybe I'll do a video at some point about that. But one of the things that is of interest here is he talks about the role of spiritual figures, of these archetypal figures that I think Superman is part of a line of, and it's these characters show not so much the truth of science, of physics. Obviously, superhero physics is a little bit funny. People laugh at it, and there are these sort of inconsistencies. But what's more important is the behavioral elements. Talking about how to act and how to live. And so this story is probably my favorite Superman story. Part of the issue with Superman as a character, a lot of people say that he's really overpowered, that he's hard to relate to. This is somebody who's essentially indestructible, somebody who really can't be defeated in any meaningful way. And how are we going to ever relate emotionally to a character like that? We all have our fragility, our frailties, and ways in which we can be harmed. And so the approach that Grant Morrison took was, it's not about the physical feats. In this book, he's even more overpowered than he usually is. It's a sort of Elseworld story, a separate universe, and he's goes to the sun and becomes basically inundated with solar radiation, and so he's faster and stronger and more invulnerable and all of this. But the solar radiation starts poisoning him, and so this is kind of his final mission, and it's a 12 arc story, or excuse me, 12 issue story, and goes on this arc with him following it. Anyway, what Grant Morrison says is the salient issues aren't so much about whether he can physically do something or not. It's the emotional elements, it's the relational elements, and I think that does it really well. One of the things I like about it is that it's not cynical in the way that a lot of comics are these days, and yet he does this story. Grant Morrison crafts this story in a way that makes it still accessible to people. There's a lot of sort of interrogation into the notion of whether good and evil even exists. These concepts are considered a little bit passé or not worthy of consideration, especially by intellectuals these days. And I think he really embodies a sense of good, a sense of justice, a sense of morality that is meaningful and embodies something to aspire to. Going back to Jordan Peterson, he talks about mythological and spiritual and religious figures as these distillations of how it is that we are supposed to live in the world. And I think that Superman represents that for a lot of people who aren't necessarily a part of any spiritual tradition. They may or may not identify as a member of any religious faith, but he works in that same way as a semi-secular or fictitious version of an ideal, an embodiment of how it is to live rightly. And The art is exceptional. People have pointed out that very plausibly, maybe for one of the first times in Superman stories, you don't see Clark as this obvious stand-in for Superman, and you can kind of see him as this big oaf of a character, someone who's used to existing in big open spaces and is clumsy and is tripping over himself in a confined urban space. And so it's really well done in that respect. There's also, spoilers, this notion or this suggestion along the way that Lex is actually the character of Leo Quintum, who is a scientist that is present throughout. And at the end of the story, Lex gets Superman's powers and he has this epiphany. He starts to see things and experience things that Superman does, and sees the connection that sort of binds people, this notion of consciousness that runs through us, and he has this spiritual moment, and Superman says to him, if you really cared, Lex, you would have saved the world a long time ago. And it's implied in there that he actually does travel back in time and Lex becomes Leo. There are suggestive elements, the X's and O's, the contrast, the inversion of a scientific mind that's used for humanity versus for personal gain, which Lex and Leo both represent. And so it's pretty amazing to think of Superman as almost this unvarnished good, someone who's able to reform even his most ardent detractor and get him to live in a way that serves humanity and serves truth. And I think it's great. It's a great story. And there are some weird elements in the middle that I don't really follow. He goes into the bizarro underworld, and there's some time travel elements that may make sense if I understood more of the Superman story. But all of that aside, it is such a good and interesting story. Probably my favorite comic, certainly my favorite Superman story. And if you're interested at all in seeing this mythic storytelling played out, I recommend it strongly. So, All-Star Superman by Frank Quitely, the writer, or excuse me, the artist, and Grant Morrison, the writer. Excellently done. Thank you all for putting this together, that creative team. Until next time.